Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text.
You know how you can just be scrolling online and you see this widely circulated chart? Maybe it's a politician showing some massive spike in crime or a company boasting about their skyrocketing revenue.
Right, you get that instant reaction.
Yeah, you feel this moment of panic or awe, and then you realize later the chart was completely manipulated, like they tweaked the axes or they squished the visual bins together, and suddenly a flat line looks like a cliff. Data is just constantly being weaponized.
Oh, it happens every single day. I mean, raw data is inherently neutral, right? But the moment a human being decides how to visually represent that data, a bias is introduced.
Definitely.
If you don't understand the mechanics behind how those charts and graphs are actually constructed, well, you're entirely at the mercy of whoever drew the picture.
Which is exactly why you are here with us for this deep dive. Today, our mission is to hand you the blueprint. We are conquering Chapter 1 of the Cambridge International AS and A-Level Mathematics, Probability and Statistics 1 coursebook.
That's a mouthful, but it is such a crucial text.
It really is. Think of this as your one-on-one tutoring session. We're going to give you the exact tools to interpret daily stats, from weather updates to sports news, and more importantly, spot when the math is being used to tell a tall tale.
We are going to build your statistical intuition from the ground up. The coursebook starts us off with the foundational rules of how data behaves before it ever hits a graph.
Right.
And then it walks us through the exact methods for mapping it out without, distorting the truth. We'll define data types, explore stem and leaf diagrams, master histograms, and finally, get into cumulative frequency graphs.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because why do we even need different types of graphs in the first place? Like, why can't we just dump everything into a standard bar chart and call it a day?
Because data comes in fundamentally different forms. And treating them all the same is, well, it's the first way people make massive statistical errors.
Right. The text touches on qualitative data first.
Exactly. Qualitative or categorical data, things categorized by words, like car colors or blood types. We instinctively know how to handle that.
Yeah, pretty straightforward.
The real complexity lies in quantitative data, the actual numbers. And those numbers strictly divide into two camps. You have discrete and continuous.
If you want to visualize the difference, think of it like the difference between walking up a staircase and walking up a ramp.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah, so discrete data is the staircase. You can be on step 1 or step 2, but you physically cannot stand on step 1.73. It's fixed, distinct values, you count them.
Right.
But continuous data is the ramp. It's an infinite analog spectrum. If you're measuring the exact time it takes an athlete to run a 100-meter sprint, you can stop at any exact fraction of a point on that ramp.
Yes, 9 seconds, 9.5 seconds, 9.584 seconds. You are limited only by the microscopic precision of your stopwatch. But I do want to clarify one vital nuance directly from the text about your staircase analogy.
Oh, sure.
Discrete data absolutely can involve non-integers. It doesn't just have to be whole numbers.
Wait, really? Give me an example.
Think about shoe sizes. You can wear a 7.5. Or U.S. coins, you have 0.25 or 0.50. Those are decimals, but they're still distinct counted steps. You can't have a shoe size of 7.314.
Got it. So it's still pixelated, just with very specific, predefined decimal steps.
Exactly. So that distinction between counting distinct steps and measuring an infinite spectrum dictates everything that follows. Now, how do we handle that pixelated discrete data without losing the actual numbers?
Because if you have a small data set, throwing it into a generic bar chart actually erases the exact numbers, right? They just get absorbed into a solid block of color.
Which brings us to a much more transparent tool, the stem and leaf diagram. It solves that exact problem of data erasure.
So how does that actually work mechanically?
It physically organizes the numbers by using the digits themselves to build the shape of the graph. You take your data value, and the last digit becomes the leaf, which you arrange horizontally.
Okay.
Then the leading digits form the stem, which you arrange vertically in equal width classes.
So what does this all mean for the raw data? It means the data is hiding in plain sight.
Exactly.
If you turn your head sideways, a stem and leaf diagram looks exactly like a bar chart, but the bars are literally built out of the raw numbers. You get the visual shape without sacrificing a single data point.
Yes, but there is a strict rule here that the text emphasizes. You absolutely must include a key with units.
Right, because otherwise, a stem of 5 and a leaf of 3 could mean anything. It could be 53 or 5.3 or 530. The key anchors it to reality.
Spot on. Let's look at worked example 1.1 from the book. It compares the number of days it rained per month in a specific town for 2 different years, 2016 versus 2017.
And to compare them side by side, the text uses a back-to-back stem and leaf diagram. So you have this central spine, the stems running down the middle.
Right.
For the 2017 data, the leaves grow outward to the right, reading normally left to right. But for the 2016 data, the leaves grow outward to the left.
The stems in the center are 0, 1, and 2, which represent 0 to 9 days, 10 to 19 days, and 20 plus days.
And by organizing it this way, we immediately see the shape of both years simultaneously. The 2016 side has a lot more leaves stretching out. If you count them up, it rained on 122 days in 2016 compared to only 74 days in 2017.
And here's where people jump to conclusions.
Here's where it gets really interesting, yeah. Because there is a massive logical trap hiding in plain sight right here in the text. You look at that chart, see 122 days versus 74 days, and your brain instantly goes, wow, 2016 was a much wetter year, way more rainfall.
Which is a conclusion the data simply does not support.
Exactly. The trap is that the diagram only measures the number of days on which rain fell. It tells us absolutely nothing about the total volume of rainfall.
Right. 2016 could have had 122 days of just light, misty drizzle.
While 2017 could have had 74 days of torrential, flooding monsoons. You just don't know.
And that right there is the most fundamental discipline in statistical analysis, drawing conclusions based strictly on what the metric measures and nothing else. You have to read the data, not the story you want the data to tell.
Okay, so stem and leaf works beautifully when we can count exact distinct values like rainy days. But what happens when our data is that messy, analog, continuous spectrum? What if we're measuring weights or times?
Continuous data presents a unique challenge because of the illusion of gaps. When we measure continuous data, we inevitably round it off to a certain degree of accuracy, just to record it.
Right, like the book's example with measuring heights.
Exactly. The text groups heights to the nearest centimeter into classes like 146 to 150 centimeters, and then the next class is 151 to 155 centimeters.
I mean, you look at those numbers on paper, it looks like there's a 1 centimeter gap between 150 and 151. If you were drawing a standard bar chart, you would literally draw a space between the bars.
But mathematically, that gap cannot exist, because the data is continuous. A height of 150.4 centimeters would have been rounded down to a 150. A height of 150.6 would have been rounded up to 151.
Oh, so the unrounded true class boundaries are actually 145.5 to 150.5 and then 150.5 to 155.5?
Precisely. The boundaries mathematically snap together. They completely close the gap.
So you have to use the unrounded class boundaries, not the rounded limits. Which naturally brings us to the ultimate tool for continuous data, the histogram.
What's fascinating here is how the histogram respects the continuous nature of the data. Because there are no gaps between the actual class boundaries. There are no gaps between the columns in a histogram. They sit fresh against each other.
Right.
But the most critical, unbreakable rule of a histogram, the thing that separates it from a standard bar chart, is that the area of the column represents the frequency, not just the height.
Okay, let me push back on this because this is where a lot of people get completely lost. Why can't we just use the frequency, the actual number of data points for the height of the column? Why are we overcomplicating a simple graph by calculating area?
To understand the necessity of area, you have to look at what happens when your class intervals, the widths of your columns on the x-axis, are not all the same size.
Let me use an analogy here. Think of your frequency, the number of data points in a specific group, as a fixed ball of pizza dough.
Pizza dough.
Okay. Stick with me. If your class interval is exactly 10 units wide on your graph, you stretch your dough across that 10-unit pan. The dough naturally has a certain thickness, which is your height.
Makes sense.
But what if your next class interval is 20 units wide? It covers a much wider range of data. If you stretch that exact same amount of data dough across a pan that is twice as wide, the dough has to get thinner. The height has to drop to keep the total amount of dough, the visual area, exactly the same.
That is actually a brilliant way to picture it. If you simply made the height equal to the frequency for a column that was twice as wide, the visual area would be massive. It would trick the eye into thinking that class was twice as full as it actually is.
Exactly.
So we calculate a specific height to ensure the area remains perfectly proportional to the frequency. And this calculated height is called the frequency density.
Frequency density, the height of the dough. And the formula the course book gives us for that is class frequency divided by the class width.
Let's run through work example 1.2 step by step to see the mechanics of this in action. We are looking at the masses of 100 children.
Okay.
The data provides a class for masses from 40 up to 50 kilograms, and there are 40 children in this group.
So the width of that class from 40 to 50 is 10 kilograms. The frequency is 40 children. To find our height, the frequency density, we divide the frequency by the width. 40 divided by 10 equals a height of 4.
Correct. Now look at the very next class. It covers masses from 50 up to 70 kilograms, and there are 60 children in this group.
Okay, so 50 to 70 means the width of this class is 20 kilograms. It's a wider pan. So we take the frequency, 60 children, and divide it by the new width, 20. 60 divided by 20 gives us a frequency density, a height of 3.
Notice the counterintuitive result here. There are strictly more children in the second class, 60 compared to 40. But the column on the histogram for that second class will physically be shorter.
Because it has a height of 3 compared to the previous height of 4, the data is spread out over a wider interval.
Exactly. The dough is stretched thinner. When you plot this out, your y-axis is labeled frequency density, which essentially means children per kilogram in this context.
And we don't just draw these rectangles to look at them, right? We actually use the area to estimate values hiding inside the classes, like in worked example 1.3.
Yes. The book asks us to estimate the number of children with masses between 45 and 63 kilograms based on the histogram we just built.
Which means we are crossing boundaries. 45 is dead in the middle of our first block, and 63 is sitting somewhere inside our second block.
We handled this by calculating the specific areas of the sessions we want. Remember the golden rule, area equals frequency. For the first block, we only want the area from 45 to 50 kilograms.
Right, so the width of that specific slice is 5 kilograms. We already know the height of that block is 4. Area is width times height, so 5 times 4 is 20 children in that slice.
Perfect. Next, we calculate the area for the second block, from 50 up to 63 kilograms. The width of that slice is 13 kilograms, and the height of that specific block is 3.
13 times 3 equals 39 children. Finally, we add our slices together. 20 children from the first section plus 39 from the second gives us a highly calculated estimate of 59 children total between 45 and 63 kilograms.
And as shown with the race times example, if your graph paper scale is friendly enough, you can even bypass the formal formula and literally just count the physical grid blocks on the page.
Oh, wait.
If you establish that 2 visual grid blocks represent one athlete, you simply count the blocks inside your interval and divide by 2. It is pure geometry. Area is frequency.
Histograms are incredible for showing us the density of a specific bracket, but they force us to do a lot of that mental math and slice calculation if we just want to know a simple running total. What if I don't care about the brackets and I just want to know how many kids weigh under 60 kilograms altogether?
This raises an important question. How do we efficiently track accumulation? And this leads us to cumulative frequency graphs.
Okay, cumulative.
Cumulative frequency is simply a running total of all values less than a given point. If you are building a table, you just keep adding the frequencies from each successive class together.
Building the table makes total sense, but the plotting rule is where it gets kind of counterintuitive. The text states an absolute rule. You must plot cumulative frequencies against the upper class boundary.
Yes, the upper boundary.
Wait, let me stop you there. Why the upper boundary? If a class is from 10 to 20, why not just put the dot right in the middle at 15? Doesn't that represent the average of the class better?
That's a common misconception. Think about the core definition of cumulative frequency. It represents the total count of everything below a specific threshold.
Right.
If you plot a point at the midpoint of an interval, say 15, you are making a massive mathematically dangerous assumption that the data is perfectly evenly spread out. What if all the data in that 10 to 20 class is clustered up at 18 and 19? If you plot at 15, your running total is completely wrong.
Oh, I see. You physically cannot close the book on that class until you reach the very end of it. You're only 100% certain that every single data point has been accumulated once you cross the absolute finish line, the upper boundary of that interval.
Exactly. We only have absolute precision at the boundaries. Let's trace worked example 1.4 to visualize the geometry of this graph. We are tracking the lengths of 80 leaves.
Okay.
The lowest possible boundary in our data is 0.5 centimeters. Since no leaves are smaller than that, our cumulative frequency is strictly 0. We plot our first point on the x-axis at 0.5, 0.
We're grounding the graph.
Then we move to the upper boundary of the first class, which is 2.5 centimeters. There are 8 leaves in this class, so we plot a point at 2.5, 8.
Got it.
The upper boundary of the next class is 4.5 centimeters, holding 20 leaves. We add that to our previous 8, giving us a running total of 28. We plot at 4.5, 28. We successively accumulate, jumping to 66, then 76, and finally plotting the very last point at the maximum boundary of 11.5 centimeters with our grand total of 80 leaves.
And when you connect these dots with a smooth curve, something really distinct happens visually. You get this elongated S shape. It starts off flat, gets really steep in the middle, and then flattens out again at the top. Why does it naturally form that specific geometry?
That S shape is called an ogive. It naturally occurs because of how data is typically distributed in the real world. In a normal distribution, you have very few extreme outliers at the low end, so the accumulation is slow and the curve is flat.
Right, the early buildup.
As you hit the middle range, the vast majority of the data points are clustered there, so your running total spikes rapidly, creating that steep slope. And finally, as you reach the upper extreme outliers, the accumulation slows down again, flattening the top of the curve out until it hits your maximum total.
And the real superpower of the cumulative frequency curve is that you can read it backwards to find thresholds, right? Like the example in the text asks us to find the lower boundary of the lengths of the longest 22 leaves.
Yes. To do this, we work in reverse. We have 80 leaves in total. We want to isolate the longest 22 leaves, which exists at the very top of our data set. Yeah. 80 minus 22 leaves is at 58. The boundary we are looking for is exactly at the 58th leaf from the bottom.
So you take your graph, find 58 on the vertical y-axis, your accumulated total, draw a horizontal line across until you physically hit that S-curve, and then drop a vertical line straight down to the x-axis to read the corresponding length. Using the curve from the book, that drops us right at an estimate of 6.7 centimeters.
It allows you to find percentiles and specific data thresholds with nothing but a visual tool. So with all these tools at our disposal, how do we choose the right representation?
Well, we've got a whole arsenal now. Qualitative data gets the standard bar charts and pie charts because they're instantly readable. If we have a small pixelated discrete data set, we use a stem and leaf diagram to preserve the raw numbers.
Yes.
But when we're dealing with heavy, messy, continuous data, histograms and cumulative frequency graphs become the gold standard.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, there is a fundamental, inescapable trade-off at the heart of classical statistics. When we take hundreds or thousands of continuous data points and group them into the large visual blocks of a histogram, we gain something invaluable. We instantly see the shape, the density, and the distribution of the data.
But context is everything. The price we pay for that clarity is that we permanently erase the precise individual values within those blocks. We have to assume they are evenly spread out inside the column just to do our calculations. We willingly sacrifice the individual trees just to be able to see the shape of the forest.
And that leads to a fascinating philosophical question to leave you with today. We developed histograms and grouped frequency tables because the human brain simply cannot process a spreadsheet of 10,000 decimal points. We needed to group things to understand them.
Right, it's a cognitive limitation.
But we are now living in an era of big data and advanced AI. Algorithms do not get overwhelmed by raw numbers. A machine learning model can process 1 million continuous data points simultaneously without ever needing to group them into a histogram.
So we're basically teaching human workarounds. As machines take over the heavy lifting of data analysis, they won't need to sacrifice the trees to see the forest. They can literally see every single leaf at once. It makes you wonder if things like class boundaries and frequency densities might one day just be relics of how human brains used to cope with math.
It really is a profound shift in how we interact with the mathematical world. But until you have an AI implanted in your visual cortex, understanding the mechanics of these graphs is the only way to ensure you aren't being misled by the data presented to you every single day.
From manipulated axes to the continuous data trap, you now have the blueprint to see through the static. You are equipped, confident, and ready to tackle your coursework and draw some mathematically bulletproof histograms. On behalf of the Last Minute Lecture team, thank you so much for taking this journey with us. Keep questioning the numbers, and we'll see you next time.